Dillian Whyte versus Moses Itauma is coming up in a matter of weeks, and one of the biggest questions that everyone has been asking is just how good is Moses Itauma? We're hoping to find out the answer to that question in this fight, but in order to answer that question, we first have to answer the question, how good is Dillian Whyte? In this video, I'm going to be doing a brutally honest review of Dillian Whyte's CV, going through each of his significant losses and wins, in a bid to try and figure out just how good the British heavyweight is. Or was. Because the Dillian Whyte we see in the ring today might not be the best Dillian Whyte. Stick with me to the end, people, as I try and review Dillian Whyte's entire CV. Hello everyone, and welcome back to A Guy Called Henry. You may notice something a little bit different about the set today. It's because I am back on British shores, people. I'm at home in Scotland. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Although I am very, very jet lagged, you know that I can't stop posting content because I just enjoy it so much. So I've brought all my stuff back with me, and I'm absolutely ready to keep up the schedule throughout the month of August, and I'm super excited about it. And speaking of the month of August, this is one of the biggest fights that we're going to have this month. Moses Itauma versus Dillian Whyte. It's a fight that I'm really, really interested in. I'm super intrigued by it. If you want to check out my video I made about the story behind this fight, then I'll put the link down in the comments below. But as I say, in this one, we're going to be jumping into Dillian Whyte's CV. And as I say, the reason is because I want to be able to say just how good I think this win would be for Itauma if Itauma was to win. Or indeed, I want to be able to say that it's not the end of the world, or maybe it is for Moses Itauma if he ends up losing to Dillian Whyte. Because boxing can be such a confusing sport, especially for the casual fan, where you're just not quite sure how good a fighter is. I don't think many casuals could tell you how good Dillian Whyte actually is, because you just don't have the context of what the division was like at the times he fought each of the guys he beat, and indeed each of the guys that he lost to. But this is a very, very popular fighter without question. Just before I jump into this review of Dillian Whyte's CV, don't forget to bang a like on the video if you do indeed like it. Don't forget to subscribe to A Guy Called Henry if you're new. And don't forget that you can buy this fight on DAZN. I'll be putting a link in the description for that as well. And as you all know, as I've said a million times, it really helps to support the channel if you wouldn't mind doing so. So I'd really, really appreciate that. So I'm going to take you through Dillian Whyte's CV now, and we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up. But just to give you a bit of context, Dillian Whyte is a guy that didn't have loads of experience before he came into professional boxing. He joined the program around 14 years ago. He'd have been about 23 years old, which is obviously quite young to turn pro. But Dillian Whyte didn't have that extensive amateur background that a lot of professional boxers do have in today's game. He actually started off competing as a martial artist and kickboxer, and he racked up a 20-1 record in K1 kickboxing. So obviously from the beginning, whilst kickboxing is a very different sport from boxing, this is a guy who is a natural fighter, and those natural fighting instincts, the mentality that Whyte brings to the ring, is one of the key reasons that I'm intrigued to see him in there against Moses Itauma, but more on that later. He then turned his hand to boxing, and as an amateur, he racked up a winning record of 6-0 with 5 knockouts. And of course, we all remember that one amateur fight where he managed to beat Anthony Joshua, and he knocked him down on the way to a points decision victory. But both guys obviously hugely inexperienced at the time, in particular Anthony Joshua, who had barely been doing any fight sports at all, and Dillian Whyte had that decent kickboxing background. And that amateur bout was a massive component in building their professional fight when they fought in the ring, and as I say, we will get into that in just a little bit. And as you can see here on Dillian Whyte's box record, turns over in May 2011, and for the first couple of years of his career, or the first few years of his career, he doesn't really fight anybody of particular note. It's more or less his first 12 fights he goes through without fighting anybody of a particular note. And then he fights one Kamil Sokolovsky. And he wins this fight by TKO. And Kamil Sokolovsky is someone I actually do remember quite well. But look, Sokolovsky, like everybody else on this list, is a journeyman. You know, if you look at the first however many guys he fought, there wasn't even a star rating against their name. Sokolovsky there was. And Sokolovsky's not a great boxer. None of these guys are. But he's the first name I actually know on the list. He's the first name I actually recognize. Sokolovsky's not active today. If I just jump over to his box rec, yeah, his last period of activity was 2023. Before that, he was having quite a few fights. But if you look at the names on his record, Fraser Clark, Otto Wallin, Solomon Dakers, David Adelaide, Cash Ali, Lucas Brown, Nick Webb, Nathan Gorman, David Price, Martin Bacole, it's sort of a rite of passage that if you're a heavyweight that's looking to move on the British scene, at some point you're going to fight Kamil Sokolovsky. But the thing is, for the first basically 4 years of Dillian Whyte's career, he hasn't really fought anybody. I mean, he fought Brian Minto, that's another name that I do recognize. And Minto finished his career with a record of 42-11 with 27 KOs. So this is a guy who did actually have a winning record. And I think, no, it was the second guy Whyte fought. No, third guy Whyte fought who actually had a winning record. As you can see, Whyte was moved very tentatively in the first part of his career, as many of these guys are, especially when they've not got that extensive amateur record. It's actually really important that they get lots of time in the ring, The thing for White was he was knocking lots of these guys out by KO, by TKO, but he built himself a nice record and he looked like a decent prospect. But admittedly, being the fair weather fan I was back then, and even now, I don't know if I really would have heard of Dillian Whyte because he hasn't fought anyone of note. He wasn't like a major signing for any particular promotional outfit. But the first time I actually heard of Dillian Whyte was when he fought Anthony Joshua in 2015 for the British heavyweight title. And this is a fight that, as British fans, we still talk about today because the build-up was absolutely fantastic. It was in an era where the British scene had been pretty quiet and pretty stagnant as well for quite some time. Literally the month before that, things had kind of been reignited by Tyson Fury, who had gone over to Germany and beaten Vladimir Klitschko to become the unified heavyweight champion of the world. But that whole era in heavyweight boxing had been incredibly dull and incredibly quiet. David Haye had come a few years before that, but he faded away. He lost when he got up to the biggest stage, when he fought Vladimir Klitschko, and Haye had so many injuries that we just never really got to see a consistently competing Haye at the highest level in that period. And so things have been looking pretty bleak until AJ came on the scene. And so this fight was something that the heavyweight scene, especially in the UK, desperately needed. And the build-up was incredible. Dillian Whyte showed everything that he's about. There was clear animosity between the two. The fight was built extremely well. And this was the fight that, even though Dillian Whyte didn't win, it really launched him into British boxing stardom. The biggest thing you could see about him here was the character. Everyone liked him as a personality. He was, or if they didn't like him, they were certainly interested in him. You know, he got attention, he got eyes, and he was a very, very controversial and outspoken figure. And look, in this fight, Anthony Joshua, for the most part, was outboxing Dillian Whyte. But Dillian Whyte showed toughness in there. He showed grit. The rounds were competitive. And there was that crazy moment when they had the fracas in between rounds where AJ hit him a little bit late after the bell. And Dillian Whyte showed him, I'm not going to be taking this from you. And he attacked AJ in the pause in between the rounds. It was absolutely insane. And had the fight not been so big, because it was a big fight, another fighter might have been pulled from the fight, might have been disqualified from that moment. But Dillian Whyte wasn't, and the fight continued. And he actually managed to show the first signs of weakness in Anthony Joshua's defenses in that fight when he cracked him with that massive counter left hook, which also has become an iconic shot for Dillian Whyte throughout his career. It's definitely his money punch. It's weirdly his fastest punch. It's so strange to see. Some fighters just have this one shot. A little bit like Ryan Garcia, it's that left hook. Same thing for Dillian Whyte, it's that lead left hook. For some reason, his body type, the way he throws his punches, the technique of it, it just means that punch works for him, or has worked for him throughout his career. And he showed us that shot in the fight. He hit AJ clean on the chin, and it took AJ a bit of time to recover. Once AJ recovered, he got back to his boxing, he settled down a bit, the animosity calmed, he went back to his boxing, and he took Dillian Whyte out very, very cleanly. And in this fight, we also saw the first sign of what has gone on to become Dillian Whyte's major weakness. It's no big secret, it's that uppercut to the chin of Dillian Whyte. So up until this point, Dillian Whyte's been fighting guys who are just journeyman level boxers. That's how I'd rank every single opponent. But he fights Anthony Joshua, he's an up-and-comer at British level. It's very, very hard for me to gauge what level Anthony Joshua was at the point when he fought Dillian Whyte here in his career. A lot of that is to do with the fact that, as I said, the heavyweight division didn't have much depth. It was pretty weak at that time. But also, this is a young AJ who's still learning and developing. He is absolutely not the AJ that we saw go to the heights he did. Although, having said that, a mere 4 months later, after winning this fight, Anthony Joshua goes on and fights Charles Martin and wins the IBF heavyweight title. But Charles Martin himself, as I say, it's a shallow heavyweight division. Charles Martin himself wasn't that great. So even though this was a loss for Dillian Whyte, how do I rank his performance in there? How do I rank this fight in general? I think at this time, I'd probably give Anthony Joshua a C+. He was an up-and-coming fighter, but he wasn't at the top of the division yet. As I say, he does go on to win that heavyweight belt, but is he fighting the best guys out there? Well, he's not fighting a Vladimir Klitschko just yet at that point, and Vladimir Klitschko is older at this time. He hasn't fought a Deontay Wilder or anybody like that. C+, maybe B. I'd give this performance from Dillian Whyte, this opponent on his CV, a C+ or a B around this time. I'm going to go with a B. So this loss for Dillian Whyte really launches him into the public minds, the public consciousness around boxing. And from here, he goes about rebuilding with 3 back-to-back fairly interesting opponents. There was Ivica Bachurin. I don't remember this guy at all. And again, this guy did have a winning record, 25-9. But he was a smaller opponent. He'd fought as low as cruiserweight. Wasn't a natural heavyweight, and Dillian Whyte was able to KO him in 6 rounds. And then from there, we see him fight David Allen. And, you know, David Allen, everybody knows on this channel, I love Dave Allen. I think he's great. I think he's a brilliant character. I think he's a really top bloke. But this Dave Allen is not the Dave Allen that we see in the ring today. This is the Dave Allen that made me so frustrated. The Dave Allen that I just really, really wanted to do well. I think this was the first time I'd heard of Dave Allen, actually, when he fought Dillian Whyte. But around this time, Dave Allen had all sorts of problems. He had issues with gambling. He didn't ever train. And he'd only had about 20 fights, professional and amateur, at this point when he takes on Dillian Whyte. It was around that number. It was something absolutely crazy. But this was the fight that really launched Dave Allen into the public mind. So again, Whyte lost to Joshua, but he got launched into the public mindset. Same thing with Dave Allen in that fight. Dillian Whyte did the same thing for him, even in a defeat. The Bachurin fight was definitely a step down from Anthony Joshua, and likewise, the Dave Allen fight is not at that level again. But I think that win over Dave Allen is still a good one. I'd say it's probably a C-, something like that, maybe a D+, just based on the fact that Dave wouldn't have been fit in that fight, and given the experience level that Dave had at the time, he wasn't the fighter he is today. So maybe in the Ds at that point. He then goes on to beat Ian Lewison, and Ian Lewison's a guy, it's kind of like a rite of passage sort of fighter on the British heavyweight scene. I remember it was one of those where when Joe Joyce was very early in his pro career, there was talk of him fighting Lewison. He took him on in his pro debut, and to give you kind of a bit of context for how Lewison was seen, it's like, yeah, this is a British level guy. He's not the best. He's never really going to win anything, but also for your first fight, that's really impressive. So I'd say that win over Lewison is fairly similar to the Dave Allen win. So again, I'm not really going to give that over a C in terms of a win. But then in 2016, he fights Derek Chisora, and this is the start of an excellent rivalry because these two guys are actually fantastically well matched. I'd say they're very, very similar in terms of the level of talent and ability that the both of them have. And in 2016, we're still talking about a very, very good Derek Chisora, the guy who is sort of fringe world level. At that time, Chisora had already been in the ring with a lot of big names, the likes of Vitaly Klitschko, David Haye, Tyson Fury, but he'd come up short against all of these guys, as I say, fringe world level, but still had fought at a much higher level than Dillian Whyte had at that time. So it was a really, really interesting fight and a good test. And whilst Dillian Whyte won this fight on split decision, it was an absolute war, and lots of people felt that Derek Chisora actually took this fight on points. I don't remember particularly well which way I scored it, but I just remember thinking it could have gone either way, that it was a super close fight. And this is the first win. This is the first really big win on Dillian Whyte's record. He's obviously only lost once up to this point in his life and his career, but this is the first one on his record where he's won it, where I go, yeah, that's a significant opponent. Fair play to you. You're actually at a good level. I give that win a B because even though Derek Chisora hasn't really won at the highest level, I mean, don't get me wrong, he had some good wins, but none of them were the top elite level at all, or even world level, to be fair. He'd even lost to Robert Helenius at that point, and obviously this is 2011 Robert Helenius, this is a different guy. But Derek Chisora was looking like, Chisora is actually an incredible guy. At one point in his career, it looked like he was at risk of fully just becoming a journeyman. He had 4 losses in 5 fights where he lost to Tyson Fury. He beat a guy called Zayas Sis, who I don't know who he is. Journeyman. He then loses to Robert Helenius on a split decision. He loses to Vitaly Klitschko on a unanimous decision. He loses to David Haye by TKO. And Derek Chisora is an absolute credit to himself, to be fair, because he always has the resilience to go and rebuild again. And to be fair to him as well, and to be fair to the situation, because the heavyweight division was so light at that time, there was always a way back. There just wasn't that many good guys competing at the top. And even before he fought Dillian Whyte, he actually had lost again to Kubrat Pulev. Again, he was probably around world level at the time. And then, yeah, he loses that fight to Dillian Whyte. So to try and give it context, it's not the best win ever for Dillian Whyte, but it does show he's in and around sort of fringe world level at that point in his career, in my opinion, at very worst European level. And I should say as well that actually, because Anthony Joshua went and fought Charles Martin, Dillian Whyte did get the chance against Ian Lewison to become the British heavyweight champion, which he did. So that's another box that was ticked in that little process there. Whyte then gets a win against Malcolm Tan to keep himself ticking over. And I think this period of his career this run he goes on from 2016 with that win over Derek Chisora is probably the best run that he puts together in his career. And this is where I think we're looking at peak Dillian Whyte in terms of his ability and performances in the ring. He goes on this run of beating Robert Helenius, and this is a pretty decent Robert Helenius. It's for the WBC silver heavyweight title. He obviously had that win over Derek Chisora, but he had only a year prior lost to Johan de Halpus. So look, this is the problem with boxing. You've always got to look at the next guy to the next guy to the next guy to try and give a win or a loss context. The point is a UD over Helenius at this point is not too bad. And it's definitely a good fight for Whyte to continue to build his CV and his understanding and his experience in the boxing ring. He then KOs Lucas Brown. Again, I'd probably give this about a C because Lucas Brown had been a champion, but I think it was that WBA regular title. So it's a version of a world title. It's not the world title. Before I'd say he gets his absolute best win of his career, I really think this is the best win of Dillian Whyte's career, was when he had a UD decision over Joseph Parker back in 2018. And this is a Joseph Parker who is not the Joseph Parker we see today, but he was still a very, very good heavyweight. He'd been world champion at this point. He'd only just had his first defeat of his career against Anthony Joshua. And I think this is the thing about Dillian Whyte. They both get the result by the same method, unanimous decision. But the difference here is that this fight is an absolute barnstormer, whereas Anthony Joshua's fight was a little bit dull, to be honest with you. The referee didn't really let Joseph Parker work on the inside. It was not the best affair. It was not the most entertaining fight to watch. Whereas this fight had multiple knockdowns. It was rough. It was brutal. And this fight really summed up why Dillian Whyte has been able to be a contender throughout his career. And it's because of his mindset. The guy is an absolute beast in the ring. He makes things a war. He makes things an absolute scrap. And whilst I believe Joseph Parker has the better talent levels than Dillian Whyte, Dillian Whyte really demonstrated and showed here that there's other levels to the boxing game. There's other things that decide whether or not you win a fight. And Dillian Whyte just really made this a war of attrition. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Dillian Whyte is a good boxer. I just don't think that physically he's as gifted as a lot of these guys are. And again, we saw it in this fight, that amazingly fast left hook that he throws. He just absolutely wiped out Parker with it. Parker got up and managed to see through the fight. Just, it's a devastating punch without question. Given the context of the heavyweight division at that time and where Dillian Whyte was at in his career, I think that is an A for me, that win. I think anytime you beat Joseph Parker, especially given he just lost to Anthony Joshua, who at the time was sort of right at the top of his game. I mean, arguably he improved, but in terms of the run he was on, people saw Anthony Joshua as invincible at that time. I think that's a brilliant win over Joseph Parker. It's a B+ or an A win for me. I'm going to give it an A, though. In his next fight, he then has the rematch against Derek Chisora. And again, this rematch here against Derek Chisora was absolutely needed because the first fight was so controversial. And this one was funny because I remember thinking, wow, this is so close again. And I think I may have even had Chisora up at the time. I think two of the judges had Chisora ahead 95-94, and the other judge had Whyte 95-94 on his card. So again, a very close fight with Derek Chisora arguably winning, and Dillian Whyte manages to find a knockout, and it's a brilliant knockout. And again, it shows you the resilience, the determination this guy has in the ring. I'd give that a similar rating to the first one because it is still very much the same Derek Chisora, but Dillian Whyte does get this one done in better fashion, so I'm going to give that win a B, something like that. Next up is when Dillian Whyte fought Oscar Rivas, and Oscar Rivas is an interesting one because it's very hard for me to give this one a grade, to give this one context. We should also say that this was around the time that Dillian Whyte fails a PED test, and it's sort of covered up a bit. It was a very dodgy one going into the fight. I don't want to get into his PED record in this video. It may be something we talk about in another one, but here I just really want to review how good his record is rather than get too much into the controversies of Whyte's career. But those are things you can go and read about quite easily if you'd like to. But he gets this UD win over Oscar Rivas. He actually gets knocked down in the 9th round. And at the time, Oscar Rivas was 26-0. He was looking like a bit of a beast, and Matchroom do a brilliant job of promoting him and making us feel like this is a very difficult fight for Dillian Whyte. However, if you go and look at Rivas's career, I mean, he has the first sort of 20 fights of his career, maybe more. They don't really mean anything. I mean, these guys are all sort of, majority of them have losing records, or a lot of winning records in there, but guys that are not known. I've never heard of most of these guys, to be fair. They're all just guys who pad the record. Before he gets a win, a TKO win against Bryant Jennings, and I can only imagine that for Jennings, at this point in his career, he's just looking to push on and keep things moving. He just had a good TKO win over Alexander Dimitrenko, but earlier in his career, he had back-to-back losses against Vladimir Klitschko and Luis Ortiz. So I imagine he would have fancied the fight against Rivas, who at that point had fought basically nobody. But Rivas gets the win, and I guess that set him up as an interesting opponent for a fight with Dillian Whyte, because Matchroom probably looked at him and thought, look, he's not actually beaten anybody except for Jennings of note. And they managed to get the WBC interim world heavyweight title on the line, which is obviously, you know, a good thing to have. I mean, it is and it isn't, right? The WBC don't order mandatories, so getting that belt doesn't really help you in your pursuit of a world title, as we found out with Dillian Whyte, who had to wait a very, very long time to get his world title shot against Tyson Fury, who was the WBC champion by the time that they fought. Before that, he was trying to get Wilder in the ring, constantly. But anyway, he gets this UD win over Rivas, and honestly, I don't know how good Rivas was because he didn't beat very many top-level guys. He fought Bryant Jennings, as I say, and beat him. Other than that, he never really had many top-level wins. He had his final win of his career in 2021 against Ryan Rosicki, and then he retired. And I just find it hard to give Rivas a score. I'm going to give it a C. I don't think it's any better of a win than a Derek Chisora. Might even be worse than a Derek Chisora win. Maybe he's less than that. It's very hard to score Rivas, but the point is, he's certainly not a top-level world-level contender in boxing. Next up, Dillian had the Marius Wack fight, and Marius Wack at this point, he's not the force he once was, but the guy can still really punch. But Dillian Whyte came into this one actually pretty heavy at 271 pounds, and I remember thinking this is a bit weird, this is a bit of a strange one. I think that was on the undercard of the rematch between Andrew Ruiz and Anthony Joshua, because they had a weird sort of reconciliation of sorts, I seem to remember. I remember Whyte telling Anthony Joshua, don't listen to any of the haters and that. A lot of that is because Whyte wanted Anthony Joshua to win because he would want to fight Anthony Joshua again in the future for his world titles without question. Anyway, that's not that important. The point is that the win over Wack was a bit strange. I remember he came in pretty heavy. I don't remember why exactly. I wonder if he'd served some sort of ban. That might have been why. But it wasn't a great performance from Dillian Whyte. So even that version of Wack, is that similar win to Rivas? Probably something like that, even though Wack is rated, as you can see here on BoxRec, as a 1-star fighter at this point. I do think that's a bit unfair. I mean, yes, Wack gets used as a journeyman fighter, essentially. He gets used as a bit of a gateway. Not even a gateway. He's the gate before the gateway, probably, if you understand what I'm trying to say. but he's certainly a guy who has a few decent wins, even if he's lost every time he stepped up. Certainly, I think his record is better than Oscar Rivas's record. So at this point, I remember Whyte was pushing very, very hard for that WBC title shot, and this is when we go into COVID, and this is when we have Fight Camp, if you remember that. It was the fight cards that were hosted in Eddie Hearn's garden by the Matchroom headquarters. And he decides to fight against Alexander Povetkin. And Alexander Povetkin's always been a really interesting fighter to me because I think he was a very, very good fighter at his best. Unfortunately for him, when he started to get lots of good opportunities, he was well past it. He's 40 years old when him and Dillian Whyte fight. And Povetkin, being a shorter heavyweight, around 6'2", he often relied on, speed and movement to get inside the longer man's reach. And obviously, as you get older, this gets harder because your feet slow down, your stamina's not the same. This is another guy who, by the way, throughout his career was using PEDs. He got busted for that. And we don't know how good he was or wasn't without them. That's kind of an issue with him as well. But when Povetkin beats Dillian Whyte, he's only, I think, 2 years after he had a TKO loss to Anthony Joshua. But in that time, he's rebuilt with a UD against Hughie Fury, had a draw against Michael Hunter, who at that time, Michael Hunter to me was one of the more exciting heavyweights coming through. And then he gets this shot against Dillian Whyte. And I think in terms of the matchmaking, I think they felt that for this fight, for Dillian Whyte, this is a win. It'll be a good win for him and he'll move on and he'll keep waiting for that WBC title shot. But unfortunately, he loses, and it is that susceptibility that Dillian Whyte has shown against Anthony Joshua. It is reinforced here as he gets knocked out with an uppercut. And it's one of the best uppercut knockouts I've ever seen. It's absolutely fantastic. I give this Povetkin that Dillian Whyte fights, he's probably a C plus B level fighter. Not because he wasn't an A at his best, but because, as I say, he was well past it at this point, in my opinion. Whyte gets the instant rematch against Povetkin, and he repays the favor and knocks him out to win the rematch. And again, this speaks to the mental strength of Dillian Whyte. I remember a lot of people saying he shouldn't get straight back in there with Povetkin. He should move on. But he took it straight away and he said, F everybody, I'm going to do what I know I can do. And again, that mental fortitude from Dillian Whyte is probably the defining characteristic of his career. I'd give that TKO revenge a B, even though, as I say, it's an old Povetkin. Dillian Whyte has conquered a guy who stylistically probably wasn't great for him. He's gone in there, he's got the job done, he's got the knockout, and he sets up his WBC world title fight against Tyson Fury. I'm sure most of us Brits, at the very least, remember what happened in this one. Tyson Fury winning this fight by TKO. It was a big fight at Wembley Stadium. Tyson Fury obviously declares retirement after this one. This is in 2022. One of many retirements that Tyson Fury obviously declared and has declared and will continue to declare throughout his career. But I obviously give this opponent an A. I think Tyson Fury is one of the best heavyweights in the world still, and at this time, certainly Tyson Fury was probably, well, we found out he wasn't when he fought Usyk, but you would have said at the time he was the consensus #1 heavyweight in the world at this point in his career. Dillian Whyte loses this fight by TKO, and again, it's an uppercut. And to be honest, guys, I think this is the last time that we see a really good Dillian Whyte in the ring. I think since this, I haven't seen Dillian Whyte perform well in a boxing ring. He comes back later this year against, in that same year, against Jermaine Franklin Jr. Jermaine Franklin's had a couple of fights against Dillian Whyte and Anthony Joshua, and it was really this fight that actually set up the Anthony Joshua fight. Joshua needed to come back after losing twice to Alexander Usyk. This was the beginning of Joshua's rebuild, and the reason that the Franklin was the choice of opponent was because Dillian Whyte had gone in there. Whyte gets a majority decision on the cards, but most people thought that Jermaine Franklin actually won that fight. It was close, but people thought that Jermaine Franklin actually nicked that one on points. I think it's quite important that I give context to the guys that Dillian Whyte has fought from Franklin forward until now, because I think this will give us a good indication of where Whyte might be at as he comes into this Moses Itauma fight. To give you perspective, before this Dillian Whyte fight, Jermaine Franklin's best win was against Jerry Forrest. And look, Jerry Forrest, again, gatekeeper for the gatekeeper. He's obviously a decent fighter, but he's like a D-level boxer, basically. And before the Dillian Whyte fight, that's the only guy that he's really beaten. He also beat Pavel Sauer, who, again, he's a guy who is a journeyman in the truest sense of the word. But he has that win against Jerry Forrest. He gets in there with Dillian Whyte, he loses. He then fights Anthony Joshua. Again, he does okay against Joshua. And since then, he's had a couple of fights to get back to winning ways. So you would suggest at that point there's been a considerable decline in Dillian Whyte. I think the best Dillian Whyte was probably before the first Povetkin fight. And so we're definitely seeing a bit of a decline here. So I'd say a serious decline, to be fair. He then fights Christian Hamer and he wins that fight by stoppage, but it's a retirement. And Christian Hamer looks absolutely terrible. Dillian Whyte doesn't look great, but Hamer basically doesn't want it. He's got no interest. And again, this is an old Christian Hamer. This is definitely another fight for Dillian Whyte just to sharpen the tools. It's actually probably a similar level of opponent to Franklin on paper, although it turns out Franklin's quite a bit better than Dillian Whyte. Thought he would be, I should say. So I'd give the Franklin win something like, it's probably a D, maybe a C at best. The Hamer win is a dreadful win. It's probably a D or an E. I think that is a really It's not an impressive win to me at all, especially at that point in Hamer's career. He's well past it. And then that brings us to Dillian Whyte's most recent fight against one Ebenezer Tete, and this was a dreadful, dreadful performance by Dillian Whyte. To give you context on Ebenezer Tete, yes, he's got a winning record, but he's not fought anybody I've heard of. He's a dreadful fighter, not a good fighter at all. He didn't look in any sort of shape in the ring, and neither did Dillian Whyte really, which is something we'll talk about in a moment because that's quite key for this fight. But it was a shocking performance from Whyte. He looked really, really bad in there, and he had an absolute war with this guy, Tete. I'd give this a D as well, probably. With all the experience Dillian Whyte has, with all the fights he's had, he shouldn't be struggling with guys like this in the ring, especially if he's got something left. It just doesn't make sense. Now, coming up, we've got this Moses Itauma fight. I don't know if it's Itauma or Itauma, by the way. I've been saying Itauma. I'm now hearing everyone saying Itauma. I'm going to stick with Itauma until I hear otherwise. And a lot of people are saying, do you know what? Dillian Whyte might actually upset this guy. Dillian Whyte might be a serious problem for this guy. Well, let's give you two scenarios here. I'm going to give you the scenario where it's the best Dillian Whyte possible that we've seen in his career. And if I think Itauma has a good chance in that fight, what that would mean for Itauma. And again, where I think Whyte is at now. So the very, very best Dillian Whyte, I think gives Itauma problems because I think the best Dillian Whyte gave everybody problems. But to be honest, if we go back in Dillian Whyte's career, I think the best Dillian Whyte we saw was around 2019. And even then, he struggled. Those fights were not straightforward for him. They were absolute wars. You know, he's always had technical deficiencies, Dillian Whyte. He's always had pretty slow feet. I'd say that Joseph Parker win, that was the only one I really gave an A, I think. That win in 2018 against Joseph Parker, that would have been his best win. So you're looking at 5 or 6 years since, 6 or 7 years since Dillian Whyte has been the best version that we could say that is probably his best form in the ring. And jumping forward now, without question, taking all the data that we have about the guys he's fought, there's been a significant decline. I think that the best Dillian Whyte gives Itauma a really, really good fight. I think it's a scrap. I think it's a war. And I'm not going to say whether or not I think Itauma would beat that Dillian Whyte because I've not seen enough of Itauma to say that. But one thing's for sure, if he beats that Dillian Whyte, you say fair play, you're a world level heavyweight. You're ready to go and challenge for world honors because that's what Dillian Whyte was doing. I don't think he ever had the ability level to actually go and win a world title based on the guys that were champions throughout the period he's been really active. But that would have been a fantastic win for Itauma. Absolutely make no question about it. But after that point, where he's gone down the hill a bit, where he's struggling with the likes of Jermaine Franklin, where he's, looking bad against Christian Hamer and Ebenezer Tete, where he's having to beat Povetkin, who was in his 40s at the time, via rematch. And given the fact we're almost a year on from his last performance against Tete, I'm really not sure that even if he does beat Whyte, that this says Itauma is ready for world level. I think this would say he's maybe European level to me, maybe fringe world level at best. And you could argue that Dillian Whyte needs those big challenges to bring out the best in himself. He needs people that are aggressive in front of him, that will fight. And also there's the question of the weight. You know, he was a bit heavy for the Ebenezer Tete fight. He was 261. In his best performances, he's always been in around the 250s. And there's been quite a few people, G-Man in particular, I've noticed commenting on Dillian Whyte looking lean and in shape for this fight in the photos and in the videos that they've seen. And that's great. He should be in shape. He should come in as fit as possible. But do I think that that's going to make any difference? I'm really not sure, because against Jermaine Franklin, he was 251. And yes, it's a close fight. And yes, we know that Jermaine Franklin is actually an all right heavyweight. But the point is that he arguably lost that fight. So even a lighter Dillian Whyte, whilst I think he'll be better than the Tete fight if he's about 5 to 10 pounds lighter, what I think was the best Dillian Whyte against Joseph Parker actually weighed a pound more than he weighed in the Christian Hamer fight. And and of course, his body composition may have been different. Maybe he had more muscle back then, less fat, etc., etc. The other side of this, of course, is if Itauma loses to Whyte, what do I think it means for Itauma? Well, I actually think it's quite damaging for Itauma because I definitely will have to slam the brakes on what I thought his prospects were as a heavyweight boxer. I definitely would have to say, look, I got this a bit wrong, because I have to be honest, I don't think I'm underrating where Dillian Whyte is right now. I just think that he is massively on the decline. I think if Itauma doesn't win this fight, we've all just got a bit carried away with ourselves, basically. And you have to look at it and go, right, well, maybe he does have a lot of raw ability, but there's some very serious holes and problems there. It might be psychological. It might be strategic. I don't know. But if Dillian Whyte does win this fight with what I think he has left, then that's a big red flag for Moses Itauma, in my opinion, if I'm being really honest with you guys. He certainly could rebuild from that point, but it just means he's nowhere near the level of talent that I thought he was. Overall, I think that in Dillian Whyte's run where he's fought prime fighters, where he's been at the world level, I'd give his career probably a C+, something like that, maybe a B-. In terms of his CV, I don't think he's got an incredible CV. He's not fought all the contenders that are out there, and he's had quite a few periods of inactivity where he's had bans and things like that. I think the Dillian Whyte we see in the ring today is probably a D+ level fighter, maybe a C-. That's my honest verdict about where he is right now. So if Itauma does beat him, I'd say it's on Itauma's record as sort of a C-level win, something like that. But what I will say is this: when you put Dillian Whyte in there with good fighters, he tends to fight better. I do think that is true. And another thing I'll say is that you know that Dillian Whyte is going to go in there, and no matter how outgunned he is, potentially, he's going to make it a war. He's going to make it very hard as he can for Itauma. He will show grit in there. He will show determination, and he will throw in spaces where Itauma maybe doesn't like it. Now, guys, I'm going to be doing a video next week. I'm going to be doing a little collaboration with Jamie from Boxing Life. We have decided to get together in Scotland, and we're going to do a video where we try and figure out what Moses Itauma's weaknesses potentially are in this fight for Dillian Whyte to exploit. So we're going to sit together, we're going to watch some Itauma fights, and then we're going to come with a tactical analysis that we're going to sort of compare and contrast and do for you guys. So I'm really excited to do that. I think you're all going to really enjoy the content. It's going to be fun and exciting, and it should be a really good piece. But I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. If you have, please bang a like on it. Please subscribe to a guy called Henry if you're new, and get your comment in the comments section below. How do you rate Dillian Whyte's CV? And where would a win for Moses Itauma rank in the landscape of today's current heavyweight division? Do you think that this would be a big win for Moses Itauma? Or do you think at this point, if he's not beating Dillian Whyte, he doesn't really have much of a career? I hope you've all enjoyed this video, guys. And as I always say, on to the next one.